Hello Warriors, this is Mars. Welcome back to another Conan Exiles PvP training room. Today we are going to talk in detail about Hyper Armor, what it does, its effectiveness, how to use Hyper Armor, what weapons have the highest value of Hyper Armor, and how armor types affect Hyper Armor. This is going to be a lengthy video, so grab some chips and a coke and take a seat. So what is Hyper Armor? How does it work? To keep it simple, Hyper Armor is any action that negates a staggering frame or any action that is not halted by a staggering blow. Your action caused by your character absorbs the blow of your opponent's attack without being halted, staggered, knocked down, or stunned while completing the original action. In Conan Exiles, there are a few key factors that can affect your Hyper Armor, which is armor type, roll recovery speed, level of agility, weapon type, light and heavy attacks, staggering ability, special weapon actions, and attack speed. So how does armor type, agility, and roll recovery affect Hyper Armor? Your armor type determines your roll speed and your roll recovery speed. Basically how fast you can roll and how fast you can get up from said roll. This is a key factor in Conan Exiles because your Hyper Armor is most effective when you have the fastest actions. For example, Light Armor has the quickest Hyper Armor frames because of its roll recovery speed. The roll recovery dictates how fast you can stand back up and complete another action. What you didn't know was the roll recovery gives you an invulnerability to stagger frames and allows you to complete your next immediate action as long as you are not interrupted. This is why roll recovery speed is so important for duels and infantry fighting. Your ability to bounce back and counter with a staggering blow can turn the tide of any battle. Light armor, however, isn't the only armor type to benefit from fast recovery speeds. Medium is almost as effective due to its recovery speed and can be almost equal by applying points into agility. The agility stat not only increases the value of your armor, but increases your roll recovery speed. All armor types benefit from having agility in their kit, including heavy armor. Although, heavy armor will never be as fast as the other two due to being more defense focused rather than speed focused. The most effective value of agility for medium and light armor is tier 3. Medium armor really shines with 26 to 30 points of agility and matches the roll recovery of most light armor builds. Granted, tier 3 agility on a really speedy light armor build can be unmatched because the amount of hyper armor their roll speed offers. What this means is, most actions followed up after a roll cannot be halted and the progress of said actions will continue. Weapons, however, are a little less straightforward. So next we're going to talk about weapons, action types, and hyper armor. To say every weapon in Conan Exiles is different is an understatement. Every weapon has their own unique qualities that cater to a specific situation. Weapons are very complex when it comes to hyper armor. Some weapons have specific frames of hyper armor that is reliant on timing of attack. Some have hyper armor on every action. Some don't have any at all. Also, not every weapon action is the same. Some are faster than others and can perform different action types. The 3 action types are the heavy attack, the light attack, and the special actions such as the greatsword's down chop, the dagger's flip, the great axe's horrible spin, and the standard kick that is on most weapons. Each action type has their own value of hyper armor built into each weapon specs. We're going to go through each one, starting from the lowest value of hyper armor to the highest. Okay, let's start with the short sword. So the short sword, when it was introduced, it has had no changes done to it. Its light attacks and heavy attacks are pretty much equal in terms of hyper armor. It's really the weakest in terms of stagger resistance compared to any other weapon. The only way I can think of making it more effective for like general PvP or for more effective hyper armor quality is using it to roll stab. Realistically, that's the only thing I can possibly think of. The one that's closest to its value of hyper armor, I should say, is Daggers. Daggers light attacks They really don't have much hyper armor. Almost anything can outstagger them. They're just really fast, and you can potentially sneak in a second attack. But their heavy attacks can potentially have a pretty decent amount of hyper armor if used. If all the combos connect, they can continue their progress. But if you stop daggers early, pretty much with a spear, you can pretty much stop their frames without even really trying. It's very easy to counter daggers in terms of just staggering. Uh, Next, I would like to say the one-handed mace. The mace, it really doesn't have bad hyper armor. If anything, it has some of the best hyper armor in the game. It's just extremely slow. It is probably the slowest weapon in the game, honestly. It can be sped up if you use the dual wield combo, and really it makes it the most effective with the dual wield combo. But on average, it's just a grotesque show of hyper armor with each swing with the one-handed mace. I mean, the strikes are slow, but they have a huge amount of hyper armor, and they can pretty much be unstaggered. Now, I know I said I would go from the least amount of hyper armor to the highest, but because of its speed, it's a very undesirable weapon unless you're using it with throwing axes. That's really how to make it the most effective. Because realistically, the first heavy attack is really just a gratuitous show of force in terms of hyper armor. The attack speed is just really slow, and you're only going to hit somebody with it if they try to trade with you. Next, I want to say the Great Axe. The Great Axe has a pretty decent amount of hyper armor, but don't use it in PvP. Don't waste your time. It's not a good weapon. I'm really trying to keep my opinions out of it. This is a video on hyper armor, not balancing, so I'm gonna focus on hyper armor. It has good hyper armor. It's just not a good weapon. It's really genuinely not a good weapon for PvP. Next is the Greatsword and the Warhammer. Honestly, I think their hyper armor is almost equal in terms of most of their attacks, although the Warhammer is slightly above in terms of heavy attack. But I'm going to talk about the Greatsword first. So the Greatsword light attacks have really good stagger resistance, which means they're pretty good at hyper armor, and their heavy attacks can almost never be out hyper armored. Almost never. There's still weapons above it in terms of hyper armor, in terms of staggering. But yeah, that weapon has a really high value of hyper armor. Its special ability, which is the down chop, it can be interrupted, but has to be certain elements at play. Not so much latency. You have to catch that weapon early on, right at the beginning of the swing. And really, it has to be a blow that is staggering enough to stop its progress. So that's why it's pretty much on the higher end of the list there. Next is the Warhammer. Now the Warhammer is kind of special in terms of hyper armor. It's been changed to where like its speed is really what's going to dictate its hyper armor. Now the first attack is all about timing, because you can easily stagger the first attack of the Warhammer. There's 3 occurrences here where you can stagger a Warhammer's first attack. Hit them at the beginning of their swing, hit them in the middle of their swing, and hit them at the ending action of their first swing. The second swing is also like that as well. The third light attack swing, if you get to the middle of that action, it is an unstaggerable swing. And the same goes for the fourth light attack of that weapon. So the stagger frames and the stagger resistance on that weapon is actually quite good compared to most weapons. Its heavy attacks cannot be broken. You cannot break the hyper armor of the heavy attacks. The heavy attacks will be completed and will progress without no halt of any kind. Granted, the only thing that can cause it to halt is if the combo is not completed appropriately. For example, if there's latency and you stop completing the heavy attack actions. Also, you can weave in the heavy attacks and light attacks, and you will not lose your stagger resistance. You'll pretty much have the same amount of stagger resistance if you do it that way, depending on the type of swings, and if you complete the first and second light attack actions. Next is the one-handed sword, which honestly is almost as good as the one-handed axe in terms of hyper armor. Excuse me. They have their light attacks can almost never be staggered because of their speed. Now, you can still stagger their light attacks. It's just that it's not as easy. What was I gonna say? It's not hard. It's not easy to stagger it immediately unless you're using a weapon that's fast enough or something that can hyper armor through those swings, because the light attacks, the one-handed sword, are very fast. You'll be able to stagger someone before they can stagger you in terms of hyper armor. Now the heavy attacks are realistically they're really almost the best in game. Almost the best. The best hyper armor frames in game is the one-handed axe. But yeah, their hyper armor can almost never be broken. The only exception is literally the same thing as the axe. You have to catch it in between actions, like the gap between time for when one heavy attack is completed and going into the next. Now the best hyper armor frames in game is the one-handed axe, hands down. There's nothing that is going to break the heavy attacks of a one-handed axe unless it's latency. That's the only thing that I could possibly think is going to break the hyper armor. They can continuously progress on you and they can never stop. Nothing is going to break it unless they just mess up their combo or they're using a shield. Now, another axe can break their hyper armor if they're using a shield, because shields for some reason reduces the value of hyper armor of a weapon. It's significantly easier to stagger somebody out if they're using a shield, but you have to catch them at the right time. Granted, it doesn't always work that way. Most of the time, if they're continuously pushing on you, they're not going to break their hyper armor. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about projectiles. So projectiles, in essence, they have way more hyper armor than necessary. I said I wasn't going to keep my personal opinions out of it, but I'm just going to use it as a framework. So projectiles like the throwing axe and the javelins, they can pretty much keep going without stopping if you spam them. That's in terms of their ranged ability. Some of their light attack functions will halt their progression. Like if you're using a throwing axe and axe combo, if you hit somebody at the correct time, you can stagger them. But if it's like a same thing with a one-handed sword and throwing axe combo. The mace and throwing axe combo, not so much. If you get hit with that, they're pretty much going to keep going. They're not going to stop. If they complete their action, they might kill you actually, because that's a really hard-hitting combo. Whereas with javelins and shields, I mean, their light attacks, let me explain. So the javelin has two different types of light attacks. Technically, their throw is a light attack. It's categorized as a light attack, and that's how it's coded in the game. So the actual javelin throw, you can keep going and never stop, no matter if somebody hits you with a hard-hitting attack or not. If you continuously throw those, they will never stagger you. I just realized I skipped over spears and katanas, so I'm going to go over that now. Starting with spears. Spears are in a very special place. Spears have the potential to break some weapons' hyper armor with light attacks. Their light attacks are designed to break the hyper armor of other weapons. Granted, do not try to break the hyper armor of really high staggering weapons like great swords, warhammers, one-handed swords, and axes. They can potentially break the hyper armor of one-handed swords, great swords, and warhammers, but realistically, do not try to break the hyper armor of an axe. You will take a lot of damage and potentially die. Its heavy attacks don't have a huge amount of hyper armor. They were changed, I want to say when spears have been changed about 5 times in its lifetime. Originally, spears had matching hyper armor to axes, if I remember correctly. You could trade with an axe and pretty much win those trades not a lifetime ago. But that's certainly in the past. That is not the same thing anymore. But yeah, heavy attacks, they can have hyper armor. They really excel the best at roll stabbing. Roll stabbing with spears has the highest volume of hyper armor dependent on armor type, It's basically medium and light if you have high agility. The more agility with spears, the better. You're in a significantly better place. Next, katanas. Katana light attacks actually have pretty decent hyper armor themselves. They don't have much range in terms of light attacks. Their damage is pretty good, but yeah, this is hyper armor. I'm gonna keep the balancing stuff kind of to a minimum. So basically, their light attack hyper armor is kind of decent. It's not bad, but their heavy attack hyper armor is pretty much up there with one-handed swords and axes. It's a lot of hyper armor for what it is, and it can be spammed, which is uh, it's a very good attack. Let me just say that. Let me just say that. It's a very good attack. I'm not gonna talk about PvP balancing in this video. This is only about hyper armor. Next topic. So, most importantly, when and how should you use hyper armor frames? So, hyper armor is something that should be instinctual. It's basically your movement and your attack types. It's pretty much a combination of it's a combination of many different things. Keep it simple. Just keep it simple. It's a combination of a whole bunch of different things. You should be using it like you're breathing right now. There's gonna be times where you need to evade. There's gonna be times where you need to counter. There's gonna be times when you just need to put pressure on someone, and you just need to initiate it with your hyper armor. Hyper armor can be used as a tool, just like everything else. It's a viable skill if used appropriately. Granted, there are means to abuse it, but it's a very capable skill that you can use, and it will benefit you if you know how to use it appropriately. So, know when to use it, know when to make the most value of it, know when to evade attacks, and just do the things you need to do. So, I feel like that was most of the stuff that I needed to talk about. I want to say thanks again for watching. If you have any more questions, let me know. Also, I want to say thank you guys so much for 900 subs. I'm almost to my goal of 1,000 subs, and I will be making more and more Conan content in the future. So, if you have any questions about hyper armor or any other questions or any suggestions for videos, let me know in the comment section. I also want to say thanks again for watching. Keep on slaying, guys. Later.